We want to give a special recognition to OFRI for helping to lead this project, and also to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to help cover our expenses. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. And after July 28th, check out the website as more classes are being added, including from our partners at Tree School East. A couple things, housekeeping things for you today. Many of you have probably been with us before on webinars, but the Zoom toolbar, hopefully you're familiar with, most of the time it's located at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see it, scroll your cursor over the top and it might pop up. Or if you're on things like iPads, sometimes the Zoom toolbar is at the top of the display. The audio is muted for both participants, as well as the video is not available for participants. You'll just see the presenters today. Written questions, we really appreciate if you could send your questions in through the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar. Really, John's looking forward to answering those and having that conversation. For the chat, if you would like have something else other than a question, feel free to put something in there. My co-host today is Mike Clausey. He's going to help answer those questions in the chat, especially if you're having any technical issues. He's also going to post resources, links to the resources and to other things in that chat. The resources can be found on the Tree School Online class guide page, and you can easily reach that from the knowyourforest.org, where you probably went to register for the class. And then after this class, we will have this being recorded, and it'll be available to watch as our previous webinars. You can get on and watch those as well. If you need OPL or other professional credits, those are also in the resource section. We will have a couple polls throughout this, so if you will participate, we'd love it. And it'll should pop up, and you can just click on those answers. It'll just take a couple minutes. And I'd like to introduce today John Souder. He's our Forest Watershed Extension Specialist with the OSU. And John is a joint appointment both in the OSU Forest Engineering Resource and Management Department, as well as the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension. And prior to coming to OSU in 2015, John was the Executive Director of the Coos Watershed Association in Coos Bay from 2000 to 2015. He's taught at the Northern Arizona University and worked as a fish and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Mexico. With his primary experience with riparian restoration is in the Oregon coast. He spent 5 years studying and mapping natural riparian areas in the southwestern U.S. He has spent the last 5 summers along with a graduate student remeasuring permanent riparian plots in the Coos Bay area. They were installed on projects, restoration projects that began in 2002. So with that, I'd like to welcome John to join me on screen. Good afternoon, John.
Hi, Julie. Really glad to be here with everyone. As Julie said, I do have a fair amount of experience, and for the past 5 summers, I have been going back and remeasuring riparian projects that we put in on the South Coast. So if I wasn't here with you today doing this, I would be out in a stand of riparian trees that are about 11 years old and have quite a bit of Himalayan blackberry. And so I would be hacking through Himalayan blackberry over my head, trying to relocate these trees that we tagged that were last seen in 2012. So,
oh, wow.
But, you know, pleased
well, I'm
to
glad
be here.
We could pick a hot day for you then to be inside.
Yeah. So, so today I want to talk about three basic areas. Let me see if I can get this moved back again. 3 basic areas. So I'm assuming that the people who are attending today are fairly new to the idea of riparian restoration. And so what I'm going to cover in this session is basically targeted towards beginners. And the first piece is how to set up a project so that it's likely to be successful, because reestablishing vegetation in riparian areas is a challenging proposition. But if you follow the steps that I outline here, I think you've got a fairly good chance of being successful at it. So we'll talk about the planning piece of that to start with. We'll talk about kind of what are the challenges that you're going to face, what you need to be concerned about, and the steps that are involved in implementing a project. And then I'll identify some sources of technical and implementation assistance. And those of you, so there is a handout, an Acrobat PDF handout available for this presentation, and that has those resources on it. And I think that Tree School will also have those available. So that's what we will cover. But first, we want to do a quick little poll to find out something about you all. So Julie.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it today. So hopefully a poll has popped up for you. And if not, you can also scroll over where it says polls in your toolbar, and it might help pop it up if it hasn't. There's 5 questions there we're asking. Help us get to know where our participants are today. So where are you from, about yourself, and what group, how many acres of forest land do you own or manage? If you have a stream or streams on your property, what is the classification? And then if what is your interest in this class? So feel free to take a minute or so and work through those. We appreciate everybody participating in the polls. It's always fun to see where everyone is if they're at their home or office, but where those are might be. And it looks like Willamette Valley area is pulling ahead by quite a bit of numbers here. So we'll give it just another minute to try and get everybody in. But John, you have attracted someone from somewhere across the US, outside of Oregon or Washington.
Okay, cool. No international people at this point?
No, no international.
Okay.
All right. So I'll go ahead and share with everyone kind of a little bit about where everyone was from. And so looks like majority of our people are in the Willamette Valley area, but we do have people on the coast in Southwest and Central Eastern Oregon. And then as mentioned, a few just somewhere outside of Oregon or Washington. It looks like the majority of our folks are woodland owners, about 65%. And then we have some natural resource professionals or nonprofits, and then some in that other category. How many acres of forest land do you own or manage? Some of them are just coming for interest, don't own any forest land, about 12%. And then most of them are the 1 to 5 acres, 6 to 20 acres, 21 to 100 acres is our lead, and then over 100 acres. So pretty spread across the acreage and ownerships. If you have a stream on your property, what is the ODF classification? And again, looks like people have varying either no streams, small fish bearing is the most, and then small non-fish bearing is also up there, and a few even domestic water sources. So again, across, but that unsure might be a good thing for us to address today, John. There's some people out there that don't know what classification they have. And then what is your interest in this class? Looks like general interest in topic and wants to restore some riparian areas on my property. So it looks like they're in the right place. That's what you're going to help them with today. So looks like we have a lot of people who have a good fit. They have streams and they are interested in learning what you can share with them today about restoring that.
Okay, so
Thanks,
then let's get started with it. So and knowing kind of who's out there is really helpful for this, because a lot of the reason that you do riparian restoration depends on the objectives that you have, overall objectives for your land management, as well as objectives for the stream portion of your land. So a lot of people like to have trees along their stream banks, both for shade, nice places to go picnic, basically for aesthetic reasons. And in many cases, they also want to be able to see the stream for it. So if you want to have trees and you want to be able to see the stream, that's going to affect how you go about replanting along the stream bank. There's a big focus on wildlife habitat now, and particularly pollinator habitat, and riparian areas are great pollinator habitat. A lot of the species are flowering in there, and you can get a diverse mix of species that gives floral displays, throughout the entire season. Also has good habitat in the branches for nesting birds. We've been seeing a huge amount of nesting birds in the areas that we've been working in this summer for it. And if you like beaver, plant a riparian area and beaver will probably show up right away for it. But also they're good areas for deer and elk, even protected areas for otter and bigger river species like that. And then finally, a lot of people are really concerned about the riparian areas because of eroding stream banks. And it's due to the difficulty of protecting of kind of structural stream bank protection measures. The 1957 Cadillac stream protection measure has fallen out of favor. It's very difficult and expensive to get permits and to put in riprap and things like that. And riparian vegetation and some of the more advanced concepts such as bioengineering can really assist in stabilizing stream banks. It's the roots in those plants and the intertwining roots in those plants that really hold the bank in place. So think about, as you consider a riparian project, think about and make sure that you kind of understand what you hope to get out of it. And particularly if you're working with other people for technical assistance, you need to be clear about what you want so that they can be clear about how best to help you with it. So think about why first. Think about where. So where you have your stream or where you're intending to put this project in really does affect the type of project that you do and the effect that that project will have. So if you're in the forested area, you're likely to you may or quite likely already have some vegetation in there, and it may be alder and you're interested in getting conifers established, or it may be alder and you're interested in getting a more diverse set of species in there. And we'll talk about the landform for it, but that forested riparian streams are a fairly unique type of restoration that has its own techniques and has its own challenges for it. A lot of you, since I saw that people had some fairly substantial acreages in their project, a lot of that you're probably going to have some agricultural land in it as well, the bottomland fields and pastures that have been put in. And these are also areas that have their own challenges. You may have a channelized stream or stream that's been channelized that goes through the project. It may have steep banks with it. Conversely, you may have quite a bit of flooding in there. Both of those are going to affect how you put a restoration project in there. You may or may not have fences, and you may, if you have fences, you're concerned about keeping the fences up, likely. And that will affect things like how big of a setback do you need from the stream to protect the fence. And then finally, if you've got smaller acreages, or if you've got the stream next to your house and you want to get some planting in there, the considerations in terms of thinking through that process really relate to the potential for your infrastructure to be affected by it. You may have barns or houses or fences that are quite close to the stream. You may not have very much room to plant in there. If something that you plant affects the channel migration, you may send that stream, moving over towards something that you want to protect, like a building. So you have to consider those factors in your thinking about and your planning for restoration. So like I said, the first thing to think about really is kind of where you are. And that was the reason that I asked the question about, do you know how your stream is classified in there? And the categories that we gave you were stream classification categories in the Oregon Forest Practices Act. So you've got basically small streams, that are, about 12 feet in width or narrower for it, and they're either fish bearing or non-fish bearing, and that is less important than for riparian than for forest practices. You've got medium streams that are bigger, probably going up to about, 24 feet in width. And those streams are going to function differently than the small streams do. They're likely to have more water in them. They're likely to carry more sediment with them than a small stream does. And then finally, you've got these large streams, like you see in this figure on the left here, where you've got big channels, broad floodplains, alluvial material in the valley floor that probably has a lot of gravel and has a lot of rocks in it, as well as sand and silt in it. But you have to be concerned that those stream banks, those areas flood quite frequently. And if you've owned land, and if you've owned a piece of land for any amount of time, you'll have a fairly good idea about what the flooding regimes are with it, because you'll have seen it over time. But what differs among these, kind of three different major categories, first of all, is how broad the valleys are. And that's where the stream, what's called a meander belt for the stream, or where the stream could move if it was allowed to move, and it's going to want to move with that. It's also going to affect the type of soils that you have. Like I said, in these big river valleys, they're very gravelly and sandy and gravelly with it. And so the soils tend to drain really well, which is good if you're looking at planting trees that don't like their feet in the water all the time. But it also means that you've got plants in there that may be stressed out by drought as the water table goes down. Conversely, in these smaller stream and these bottomlands, if you've got clay soils, those clay soils are going to hold the water longer in the spring, but when they dry out, and they're really dry. And so there are certain species that handle that really well. For instance, Oregon white oak is one of those with it. And so understanding the soils is going to help to understand what plants and where plants are going to be successful. And then finally, in these upland higher gradient streams, you typically have very narrow valleys. Where the stream is going to be where the stream is. It's unlikely to move around significantly in those constrained valleys. And you've got a steeper slope in there. You've got less fine material, less clay and silt typically in there compared to the bottomlands. And so that's, and you may have a lot of shade in there too, so that it's going to be much more temperate environment for your plants to grow in. So these landform soils and moistures are really going to affect what's suitable to grow there, as well as then what you need to consider when you're implementing a project in terms of setback from the streams, setback from the bank in particular. So talking about banks, there are essentially 5 different zones to think about in a riparian area. And depending on your particular situation, you may or may not have some of these zones. But every place will have a tow zone that's right next to the stream. It typically has water in it or on it, at least seasonally on it with it. And then you've got a bank coming up from that tow zone, and the bank can either be gentle, fairly gentle, as you see in the picture here, or in some cases the bank can be very horizontal, particularly if the stream has incised over the years with it. And then above that bank, you are likely to have a zone that gets overland flow at least once or a year, every couple of years or so during the bigger storms with it. And that overland bank zone is really important for a number of reasons. One is as that water picks up, and if it's getting into that area, it means that you've had a fairly good freshet coming down there. And with those freshets come a lot of sediment with it. And that sediment is actually very fertile soil. What happens is when that water comes up over that bank, into that overbank zone, it slows down. And as the water slows down, it drops that sediment out of it. So you can have that bank actually build up. And in some broader floodplains, at least down here on the coast, you can get natural levees that are built up over the years because that overbank flow gets up over it, drops its sediment out next to the stream, and then that tends to build up over time. So the overbank zone is actually one of the more important places to think about planting and the effects of planting. Then you have a transitional zone that's going between what we think of as more the kind of moister stream affected zones, like the overbank zone and the bank and the toe, and the upland zone. And the upland zone is familiar to all of you because that's where most of your forestry is with it. And so then you've got this transition zone that's still influenced by the stream and still influenced by the groundwater that's connected to the stream, but it's going to be drier because it's further away and higher from the stream. And so again, there are specific species that are going to do well there. It's less disturbed. You're less likely to get damages from flooding in there. So the kind of things that are affecting the transition zone may be more similar to the things that affect your upland zone compared to the overbank zone. So think about when you go out and look at a site or actually even map out your riparian area, think about what these planting zones are, because you're likely to want to plant different things in different zones for it. And we can talk about that a little bit more further in the presentation. So you tend to think about riparian restoration as, geez, this is a biophysical kind of agriculture forestry process. But in riparian zones, there's also a lot of social considerations. And this is particularly important as you get into smaller areas in rural residential areas where your neighbors are much closer. And in many cases, the stream actually may well be a property boundary. So you've got neighbors across the stream from you, and what you do on your side of the stream is going to affect their property, and it's going to affect their management. So one thing to consider is if you have close neighbors to your riparian zone, if you plant something, is that likely to shade their field or their yard, or is it likely to cut off their views? And if that's the case, it would probably make sense to have a conversation with them and just chat with them about what you're proposing to do, because it's easier to do that beforehand than have to deal with it afterwards. And I can tell you from experience that neighbor, and many of you probably also have those experiences, that neighbor disputes are not something that you necessarily want to get into if you can avoid it. Another consideration that we found, and this photo on the bottom right is from one of my projects. There's a stream there. It's a little bit difficult to tell between those conifers, is Rogers Creek. And we had planted this area pretty densely. It had a lot of shrubs. It had a lot of deciduous trees in it. It was part of a CREP project, so it was in the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. We had a landowner change, and that landowner ran a construction company, heavy equipment construction company, and was running a lot of equipment around that corner. And he did not like the fact that he could not see around that corner. He did not like the fact that people were driving really fast around that corner, oncoming traffic for him. So he came and he cleaned out everything, most everything except for a few of the conifer trees, so that he could see the stream, or he could have better sight lines on the road. And that wasn't the only case where we ran into that kind of time and time again. because in a lot of rural areas, the roads, or the county roads in particular, follow stream courses, and the streams are curvy and moving around, and so the roads are also curvy. And so maintaining sight lines is important to people who drive those roads every day. Now, you could say it maybe encourages them to drive a little bit faster than you would like, but nonetheless, you don't necessarily want to be in a situation where you're creating a hazard for people. Then there's also some regulatory constraints that you may need to consider in terms of the site planning that you do. A big one is easements. Power line easements are very common. Pipeline easements are less common. But power line easements give the power company a certain right of way, and even in small lines, it's a 30-foot right of way typically. Bigger lines, it's even wider than that. It can be up to 100 feet. And if you plant things underneath that, there's no guarantee that down the road that the power company's not going to come in and cut that stuff down or spray it out. And we've had a number of cases where that actually happened. In one case, we were carefully monitoring the stream temperature in this creek, Willamette Creek, for years, watching the stream temperatures go down as the riparian vegetation got bigger and got more well established, until one summer we looked at the data, and the temperature at this one site had popped back up again, and we're trying to figure out what it was. So we went out there and looked at it, and sure enough, the power company had come through and trimmed a line, trimmed the right of way along there, and opened it back up to the sunlight. So understanding that, and if you do have that type of easement on your property, it makes sense to talk to the right-of-way maintenance folks at the power company to make sure that what you would like to do is consistent with what they, as the easement holder, is willing to accommodate. Also, a number of counties have riparian ordinances, and so those riparian ordinances are typically focused on protecting riparian areas. And so you say, gee, well, I'm wanting to restore a riparian area. It's nothing but Himalayan blackberry and other weeds right now. So what's the problem? Well, some of the riparian ordinances are written so broadly that actually cutting any vegetation in the riparian zone violates the ordinance. And so before you get involved in this, again, it makes sense to get in contact with your county planning department and check and make sure that what you're proposing to do is consistent with the ordinance. And if it's not consistent with the ordinance, what it takes to get a variance if you need to have a variance for it. And then finally, if you're planning on doing more engineered solutions to things, particularly if you're placing material in the channel or you're removing material out of the channel, like you're pulling back a stream bank or something to make the bank gradient gentler, you may need a permit, a fill and removal permit from the Department of State Lands or the Corps of Engineers. Both of those agencies kind of have fast track process for restoration projects. But again, you can't just ignore that, because again, you don't want to have somebody showing up on your doorstep saying that you violated some permit regulation, and now you need to do something, and that doing something is probably going to involve a lawyer, so it will get expensive. Okay, so those are the site planning parts of it. It's also useful to think really in the beginning about how you're going to get this work done. And this is going to depend a lot on how difficult it is to get into the site, how big the site is, how many plants you're going to put in the site. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there's essentially three ways to do this. One is to kind of outsource it by contracting it, and you can hire a contractor. And small jobs, the contractors would typically be landscapers, bigger jobs, the contractors are typically organizations that do reforestation. So the people who are planting your trees on a hill slope after a harvest are the same people who could come in and plant your riparian area as well. Or you could outsource it by working with another organization like a watershed council or a soil and water conservation district that would kind of take on that project for you. You would be the landowner. They would work with you to get the project implemented. If you've got a smaller project and or if you've got a bigger family or network of friends who can socially distance, and we'll talk about tree spacing, but you can do it yourself with it. And again, it depends on how fast you want to do it and how much you have, and do you have the physical capability of doing it and are willing to put the effort into it. But it's a great activity for to involve multiple generations in a family coming out there, particularly if you can get kids involved in the planting and they watch their trees grow over the years. And you can get, because these areas have a lot of moisture in them typically, you can get some fairly substantial growth in 10 or 12 years. And the kids get attached to that vegetation, and then you can convince them to take care of it for it and to perpetuate it if they're inheriting the property with it. And then finally, planting projects are very attractive to get volunteers involved with it, whether it's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a service learning project. Even lots of organizations like banks have service learning opportunities, so they will send all of their people out to volunteer on a project. There's hazards associated with that because you've got a lot of untrained people doing something that actually does require a little bit of skill to do successfully. But again, it brings a lot of people in, and they get a good sense from participating in that activity. Okay, so that's kind of the planning and overview of the planning piece of this. I want to offer folks an opportunity to ask some questions related to the conceptual part of thinking about restoration. So if you've got those questions, let Julie know, and she's going to refer them to me, and I'm going to try and answer them.
Thanks, John. So the first question came in right after you had started, and I think that poll prompted it. How do we find the ODF classification? And just so you know, Mike and I posted about the Oregon Forest Protection Laws in the illustrated manual in the chat. So if you wanted to refer to that too, we put that resource up.
Okay, so I don't have my copy of the illustrated guide to the Oregon Forest Practices with me. I usually do. I actually use that as a text in a class I teach at OSU. So one way to do that is, as Julie said, is you can look at the illustrated guide. You can contact your Oregon Department of Forestry stewardship forester. That's the typical place. They have maps for that. You can, if you are familiar with forestry or done any forest operations on your own, ODF has a web-based system called Ferns, and I could screw up the acronym here, so I'm not even going to try and do that. But you can get that through the web by going first to the Oregon Department of Forestry. That is the web-based system that people who are planning forest operations use to notify the state that they're planning this operation. That has a map-based system on it that you can pull up a layer that actually has the stream classification. So you can zoom to your property or the part of your property that has the stream that you're interested in. You can click a box on the web mapping application and it will pop up the stream classification for it. My sense is for most of you, the best route to go is to contact the ODF stewardship forester in your area. And then additionally, most of the Soil and Water Conservation District staff and Watershed Council staff can find stream classifications for you.
And this goes along with it. Someone has a small non-year-round stream and would like to know what requirements are for this type of area. So along with the classification, they want to know kind of what's required.
Well, that's a forest practices issue that I don't really want to get into here with it. So again, yeah, the first source of information on forest practices is always the ODF Stewardship Foresters, and they're a really good group of folks to get to know anyway for that. So I would refer you to them for that.
All right. So moving away from the laws, someone says that their property, they've had several creeks shown in like historical pictures, but they think development of paved roads, logging have made the whole property a drain for considerable runoff. Is it possible to reconstruct more mindfully use of all this water closer to natural ecologies? So an upland gradient type according to your slide.
So yes, and again, I'd go back to the illustrated guide to forest practices. That has some good sections on forest roads, and really one of the big effects that forest road have is that they basically heighten the drainage of water. They quicken the drainage of water because they're intercepting all of this water that's coming off of the slopes. They're putting it into ditches, and then those ditches very rapidly drain into streams like that. So there's a concept in kind of watershed restoration called hydrologic disconnect. So you want to disconnect the roads from the streams. And that's done basically by taking the water that's collecting in ditches and funneling it off into a buffer area before it gets to the stream with it. And so when that buffer area then filters out all of the sediment that's coming off of the road and that's coming off of the cut bank, and then it sinks into the ground rather than running directly into the stream. That's a great project to talk with your watershed council and your soil and water conservation district about. There's a lot of interest in working with landowners to do that.
Good. Someone says, when do I need to maybe get a conservation easement to protect the region or the restoration work? So probably maybe live beyond their current expectations.
So what I've seen, and I've been working on the coast now for about 20 years, is that if you want to put land in a conservation easement, you can do that. It is a legal process. One of the big considerations for that is who is going to hold the easement, and how, and there are costs associated with conservation easements. So that a conservation easement, to be kind of legal, has to be visited every year by the party that holds the easement. And so that's not costless on the part of the easement holder. And so you'll have to find somebody to do that. There are a number of land trusts in Oregon, and there's a coalition of Oregon land trusts. So that's a place that you could go to kind of see who the land trust was in your area and make those connections with them for it. There are other ways to protect land. It depends on the length of time that you want to protect land. There's conservation incentive programs that are run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and those are contract-based, 10 or 15-year basically contracts to protect areas. But if you do want to protect it kind of in perpetuity, there are some programs to do that. The federal government has a wetland reserve program that can have perpetual easements on it. Again, I suggest talking to watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts or your local NRCS office.
Great. Last question for this segment. Are there liabilities associated with restoration improvements and infrastructure?
Oh, well, there's liabilities associated with getting up in the morning, I think, and taking your first cup of coffee. The liabilities, I think, are revolve around whether something that you do has an adverse effect on someone else. And so how close that connection is probably relates to how how big a risk the liability is with it. So you've got, if you have volunteers out on your property planting, yeah, you've got some liability there. It's fairly well known how to do the waiver process to get to reduce that liability. You know, if you're planting along a road, it grows up, you know, it obscures the sight lines in there. You know, somebody comes around the corner too fast, hits one of your trees. Well, you know, anybody's going to sue for anything these days. But you know, how much risk is it to you? You know, it depends on how comfortable you are with that and how much insurance you have, for one thing, with it. So there's not, I think in overall terms of things that you can do on your property, revegetating your riparian zone is fairly low risk.
Great. So from here, we'll let you continue on, and we'll see you again in about 40 minutes, if not before.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. And thanks everybody for those. Those are great questions. And that reminds me that a colleague of mine and myself at Extension do offer a course in effective forest roads. And we spend a lot of time in that course talking about road drainage and hydrologic disconnect. So if you're interested in those areas, get in touch with me and we can see if we can make something happen. So, all right, so we're going now from planning to thinking about design. So when you've decided that you want to get a riparian area established on your property, there's essentially 3 decisions that you have to make for it. You have to think about what species you're going to plant. You have to think about what kind of stock you're going to plant. And we didn't ask the question about, you know, who all has planted trees in the past, but I'll go through some different stock types and talk about those. And then you also have to think about how you want to plant them. So, and the planting arrangement has a couple of factors. One is how many do you want to plant? And then what kind of arrangement do you want to plant them in? And so recall back that we had those 5 riparian zones, and different plants are suitable for different zones in there. And then different species interact and compete with each other differently too. So those are all considerations. So we'll go through, you know, fairly quickly now. We talk in Extension a lot about finding the right plant for the right site. And when we talk about right site, it really is, you know, how resistant is it to the effects of flooding with it, which means high water, you know, and in some cases standing water, really, versus, I mean, you can have water come up and if water goes down, again, it really doesn't affect a plant that much. Some plants actually are more resistant to high velocity water, and that they tend to bend over rather than break. So that there's a factor there, you know, tolerance for flooding too. Also, how tolerant are they to drought conditions with it? You know, because you may have a lot of water in the winter, and recall back to the slide on the different stream types, but soils hold water differently with it. And so if you have sandy and if you have gravelly soils, that water drains off pretty rapidly for it. It doesn't stand. Whereas if you have clay soil, you know, that water is going to stay around longer, and then when it dries out, like I said, it's going to be very dry. And so some species are more suitable to plant in places that have clay soil that goes between being really wet in the winter and really dry in the summer for it. And similarly, some species are more shade tolerant, and some species just cannot handle shade. They need full light for it. Douglas fir, for example, that's why we have even-aged Douglas fir stands, is because it's a real pioneering species and it wants full sun for it. Other species, you know, essentially get sunstroke from being out in the full sun, and so they grow better underneath the shade of another tree. And so, you know, as you go about thinking about the design, then you want to think about what plants are going to fit well in different planting zones. For example, typically when we're down at the toe of the stream, right at the edge of it, we're looking at plants like willow is very good there. Cottonwood will work well. Dogwood is really good there. And willow and dogwood actually bend over really nicely in the high flows, so they don't get uprooted and they don't break off, and they have very thick root mats that intertwine and really protect the bank. So those species are really nicely adapted to the toe, and they don't do as well in the upper areas where it dries out more in the summer. And so something that does really well up in those areas, and particularly in that clay soil, as I said, is Oregon oak or Oregon white oak. Does well in there. Ash does well when things are really wet all the time for it. Cedar does well in wet spots and will do well in the full sun, and also does pretty good in shade as well. So finding that mix and match is important when you plant. And then you have to think about what your planting strategy is. So for instance, most restoration projects, and at least the ones that I've been involved with, you go out there and you plant everything you want in there at one time with it. So you're mixing plants that are shade tolerant with plants that are shade intolerant. You're not necessarily, if you're using this planting zone plan, you're dealing with the flooding and the drought in the planting design, but not so much the shade. So then if you have a piece of property and you're interested in doing this over a long period of time, you have the possibility of going in and planting those shade intolerant plants first with it, letting them grow up, and then come back and underplanting those shade tolerant plants with it. And that's a process that's kind of still under development in terms of the kind of theory piece of it. But that's something that actually should allow you over time, if you've got that ability to spend some time getting your site established, that's something that should be able to give you a very nice diversity of both species and structure. So you've got the taller trees are likely to be the earlier ones of things like grand fir that grows really quickly. You'll get taller trees, and then you'll get different canopy levels in there, which is very important, particularly for things like birds. So again, right plant for the right site. Think through that. Some of the resources at the end of the presentation that I give have more detail on how to choose that. So we talked about planting types for it. So if you've been involved in forestry on your property and you've replanted in your property, you're probably familiar with bare root plants. And these are plants that are grown in nurseries, in rows in nurseries. They're lifted or they're pulled up typically in the winter. So, largely around here in late December, early January or so, they're lifted up. They shake the soil off the roots. They package them typically in bundles of 100 trees, and they put them in a cooler. And that's how you will get them, as bundles in a cooler like that. And then you're out and you've got a shovel, typically a shovel. Don't use a hodad on flat ground because you'll get a slanted hole for it. But you've got a shovel, you dig a hole, and you push the roots down in there and tamp it back in. That's the traditional planting practice, both for upland areas as well as riparian areas. And it has worked for a number of years, and those trees are pretty inexpensive. Now there's other plant types available. So plugs are getting really popular for a number of reasons. One is that they're pretty easy to handle with it, and they're pretty easy to get established because the roots are protected by the plug. You just dig a little, basically cylinder out of the ground, and there's some tools to do that, or you can go back and use the handy shovel, and you just stick it in there, and again tamp it in. But the plug itself has protected the fine roots better than a bare root plant has. And then anybody who's done gardening is familiar with container plants or potted plants, and those come anywhere from, I don't think I would use a 4-inch pot for it, but a 6-inch pot up to a gallon, and some of the biggest ones I've seen are 5-gallon pots. So those are available. Again, you can get a large diversity of species with them. They're going to be more expensive because they've been grown longer, and you're paying for the pot itself, and they're going to be a little bit more difficult to get out to the site, and maneuver around for it. And then finally, the other type that's actually is really easy to use as a landowner is cuttings for it. So you take species that are suitable for cuttings, and willow suitable, cottonwood suitable, dogwood, and ash, are all species that propagate well from cuttings. And so you take a cutting, and there's a little bit more to it than what I'm going to describe. But you basically take a cutting during the dormant period of it, and then you get it planted into the ground, and you get it down to the water table. And then that cutting it has, most of those species have natural rooting hormones in them, so that they will generate roots just once they get into the soil, and the soil is moist. So that's really that's about the most inexpensive way to go with it. And again, the species that are most suitable for that are the species that are also suitable for that toe and that bank area, because they have evolved to reproduce or to repropagate through floods, where they're uprooted and their pieces are broken off and things like that. And so, what you're doing is just basically mimicking kind of a flood, that comes through, and you do the cutting, and then you place it in a suitable place for it, and it takes off with it. So those are basically the types that you will get. They vary a fair amount in cost with it. And so you'll have to make a decision both in terms of what's available, what you can afford, and kind of how difficult it is to get out and plant. So in terms of getting the stock, so now we kind of went through the stock type. So how do you get it with it? And so I talked about cutting, and the guy on the left there is actually using a weed whacker with a saw blade on it to cut poles for it. I think that might be cottonwood. I'm not entirely sure. You can grow your own from cutting with it, and that's what the nurseries do. Is take a small piece of a plant, put some rooting hormone on it, put it in potting soil, keep it moist, it will develop roots, and then you transplant that out to your site for it. So you can actually do all of that stuff yourself. It's not that challenging with it, or you can buy it. And we're finding that there's a lot of native plant nurseries out there. And because people are doing restoration work like this, and a lot of organizations are buying in bulk now, so a lot of nurseries are responding to those needs, and so you can find that stuff. So the question that you need to, the consideration down there in the bottom that folks need to be aware of is, you want to make sure it's available. And part of available is, of course, the cost, how far it has to go for it, how many you need. And if you need a lot of them, you may want to contract with a nursery to either, allocate something that they're already growing that you have a contract to purchase, or they may grow stuff for you with it. Those are fairly big size orders for it, although you could go in with a cooperative, again, with watershed councils, with soil and water conservation districts are doing that. You need to be careful about transporting plants. So again, the most challenging plant to transport really is bare root plants in many ways, because if they dry out, they're dead for it. But if you've got a lot of potted plants, then those take up a lot of space, and so you've got to get them from wherever you're buying them from, out to your site. And so that may involve driving on highways with it, and then it may involve transferring all of those pots to a smaller ATV or smaller trailer to get them into your site, and then physically actually carrying them out to the place that you're going to plant. So thinking through all of that stuff in advance means that you're prepared for what you're going to end up having to do. Finally, I want to say a quick word about sanitation. So there are some known pathogens that are in nursery planted stock that are in nurseries. If you've heard of sudden oak death, Phytophthora ramorum, that started in Oregon as a result of nursery stock, and nursery stock gets moved all over the country with it. So making sure that you're not transporting pathogens from nurseries out around to your riparian sites is increasingly recognized as being important. And we've got some good extension work going on now to coordinate with nurseries, and particularly these smaller kind of homegrown do-it-yourself native plant nurseries, to make sure that their sanitation is up to snuff, so that they're not causing additional problems when we all think that we're restoring areas and end up moving pathogens around that cause outbreaks of disease in the wild. So keep that in mind. That's something you can ask a nursery about. That's something you can ask extension about if you get involved in that. So, so you've got plants. You know what your species, or you think you know what your species are. So then the next choice is, how many are you going to plant? How dense are you going to plant this? And if you've been involved in any of the traditional forestry planting, I mean, you're typically you may even be planting on a 12 by 12 or 8 by 8 spacing or something like that. So you're on the order of 300 to 600, 700 trees per acre with that. Most planting that occurs in riparian areas is much denser, and some of it is quite a bit denser. But a 6 by 6 spacing is not considered to be anywhere too dense in riparian areas. For one thing, because the survival tends to be less in them. So you've got a lot of factors that are kind of acting against you, and you don't have some of the tools that you have with an upland forest plantation in a riparian zone. So you're likely to want to plant denser with it, and so go to a 6 by 6 is not very dense. 4 by 4, 3 by 3. In some cases, if you're planting along a bank and you want to protect that bank, or you've got beavers for sure, you want to plant very densely. And if you're using willows, then you may be planting at a 1 by 1, spacing along the toe of the bank in there, and that may be what it takes to be successful with it. And it is, I mean, the willows can be very successful in protecting stream banks from erosion for it. So you've got a density there. And the idea is, well, if you've got the toe piece with it and the bank piece, the idea there is to plant it dense enough so that you get the interlocking roots that are going to protect the soil from erosion. As you move up the bank, the challenge there really is you're going to have a lot of competing vegetation, whether it's Himalayan blackberry or grasses or other weeds. And what you want to do, the easiest way to deal with that competition from weeds is to shade them out. And so the way you shade them out is you get a complete crown closure as quickly as possible. And you get that crown closure, as you can see from the diagram on the right, you get that crown closure more quickly the closer that you plant the trees together. Now, at some point, once you get that crown closure done, and you say, oh, great, I've got a crown closure done. Well, now you start getting interspecies competition between the trees. And so then you've got to start thinking about, okay, so some of these species are going to go really quickly, and are they going to shade out and essentially kill the other trees that are slower growing but yet still need full sunlight. So that's a combination of the spatial arrangement of the planting as well as how dense you plant it with. So those are all choices. One of the better guides for doing this is that riparian planting guide for the Willamette Valley that Extension wrote, and and there's some good advice in there about density and planting, and that's where this chart came from for that. So questions for the design phase of things? Julie, what do we have?
Hi, John. Yeah. So one of the first questions came in right now after the last session, and it says, how do I find my local watershed council? And we did post in the chat the link to the Know Your Forest, the assistance map, that they can find their stewardship forester and their watershed council. But anything else on watershed councils and how to connect with them?
Well, there is a network of Oregon watershed councils that I happen to be the treasurer of. And if you go to www.oregonwatersheds.org, you get to the network of Oregon watershed councils, and there's a map in there and a list of watershed councils in there. Virtually every area of the state has a watershed council. So you will be, you will have some coverage by a watershed council as well as every area in the state has coverage by soil and water conservation districts. Great.
Someone else asks, is there a guide for sedges, rushes, the plants in the water in flooded areas?
Yes, there are. There are some wetland restoration guides out there. I think there's a pretty good one that the Corps of Engineers has. I'd have to go look for those. Sedges and rushes and things like that are almost a whole different set of practices than for riparian trees. A lot of what's done with those, I mean, you can buy seeds for all of those. So you can buy seeds and spread them around. And actually one project I did, we hydromulched them, cattails. So we got a bunch of cattail heads and put them in with a bunch of mulch and just blew them over the wetland and got that established. But I'll try and find a resource that we can use for sedges and rushes.
Great. And then also, any guides or suggestions for improving microflora of soil when you start your planting?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So we have tried, so I'm assuming that this is related to mycorrhizae with it. So I have known people, I have not done much with mycorrhizae in riparian zones. I've known people who have done that. I'm not aware that there's any real good research on it. Frankly, there's not a whole lot of really good research in this field in general for it. I have done some in planting, putting fertilizer tablets in, and my experience was varied with that. I think in some cases they got too close to the tree and actually burned it. This was a case of some cedars with it. I think most riparian areas, actually the soil is pretty fertile because it's all, silt that's come in from the stream. And in a lot of cases, I think you've got a reasonable mycorrhizae community in there now. So that's not to say there aren't exceptions to that area, but that's not something that I've really necessarily seen a big effect with.
Great. And then the last question for this segment, is it safe to use herbicides in the riparian area?
Yes, as long as they're aquatic labeled. And so, and then there may be also other regulations that you have to do about how close you go. But we've used herbicides quite effectively. You need to be clear. Well, first, always, I mean, the label governs the regulations for it. And so the label is the legally enforceable set of criteria for the use of that chemical in an area. So in most riparian areas, you would want something that's aquatic labeled. You'd also want to make sure, either through the Oregon Department of Agriculture or the Oregon Department of Forestry, that there weren't other regulations that restricted its use next to a stream. There may be a 10-foot buffer, things like that. If you have a domestic water source stream, you probably want to be especially careful with that, especially if it's not yours. But if you have weeds, but herbicides are an effective tool for weed control if that's something that that your values allow for. And it is a good way. I mean, in terms of site preparation, it can be particularly important for reed canary grass and Himalayan blackberry, which are probably going to be the two biggest weeds that you face.
Sure. Great. That is all the questions for now.
Okay, so we've gone through kind of planting for it. Let's think about implementation for it. So, okay, so you've got your objectives in mind, you've got your design in mind. So now how do you get this done out on the ground? Because that's where the rubber hits the road, as they say, for it. And so typically this is, three kind of different parts of this process. So first you have to prepare the site for it. And I think I've alluded to it, at least, that that's a pretty critical effort in there, because if you don't get the site well prepared, you're going to be fighting it for the whole rest of the project. So if you don't get the weeds controlled, you're going to fight them. Second part is, kind of how do you handle your planting stock and get it into the ground reasonably well. And then once you've got things planted, then what are your things that you're facing in terms of keeping it alive until it's self-sustaining for it. So in terms of site preparation, I mean, most of these sites are not bare ground that you're going to go out there. They or even if it's a pasture, as many of you know, as soon as if you've got a pasture that's being grazed, as soon as you take that grazing off of it, you start getting weeds growing up. And typically a lot of blackberry growing up. So you absolutely have to get control of that before you start trying to plant. And that may take a couple of years or so. And a lot of the restoration projects that are done at kind of almost a commercial scale for it, there's, increasingly people are recognizing that it may take 2 years to effectively control the competing vegetation. You may have to mow it. You may have to spray the regrowth for it, or you may have to mow it repetitively until it uses up all of its reserves, carbohydrate reserves, and essentially just starves itself out. But you've got to get control of that site beforehand, because otherwise you'll be fighting it. And the money that and the effort that you invest in site preparation is going to be effort and money that you don't have to spend for maintenance afterwards, guaranteed for that with it. So like I've been saying, you've got to remove the competing vegetation for it, because you want to give the plants that you're planting, which tend to be fairly small and fairly fragile, you want to give them the best chance you can to be successful and grow and thrive on that. In some cases where you've got really steep banks on it, if you've got a vertical bank going down, and you've got, basically the toe is at the base of this bank, and then you've got at the top of this bank, you've then got almost your uplands or your overflow bank for there. And you've got a lot of material sloughing off, eroding off of that bank. You may want to pull it back. And if you pull that back, and that's like the last couple of photos on the right there, if you pull that back, it's going to take an excavator probably to do that efficiently. And if you start pulling it back below the high water mark, you are going to have to get a permit for it. And again, watershed councils, soil and water conservation districts are great sources for assistance in working through that permitting process for it. Calling the state up or calling the Corps of Engineers up, cold on this stuff is probably going to be very frustrating for you with it. But contouring the bank is good, and that resets basically that planting zone from the toe up to the upland for it. If you're brushing things, I mean, you can do a lot of brushing with the weed whacker if you're patient with it. But a lot of work that's done in bigger areas are done with excavator mounted flail heads on it, basically flail mowers that go on the end of an excavator arm, and they can reach over and get down and mow this stuff down. They're not very nuanced tools, so basically you'll cut everything in there, and you may have some trees that you would like to preserve that you lose through that process. But that does work. Spraying works, as well. If it's blackberry, then you've got the canes to deal with, and that may take a while before they deteriorate to the point that it makes it easy to get into plant, because if you kill all the blackberry and you've got those canes, you're going to have to plant through it. So knocking that stuff down first is oftentimes a fairly good strategy. Problem weeds. So we've talked about problem weeds with that. So Himalayan blackberry, I think everybody's pretty familiar with. I have no fear anymore of blackberry. I've waded into this thing with it over my head, crawled through it, climbed over it. Good set of double-fronted Carhartts, a long sleeve shirt, and the gloves that rose growers use on it that have big gauntlet arms. Those are all good tools to have if you're working with blackberry for it. Reed canary grass is pretty pernicious. It has a couple of traits to it that make it difficult to work with in a riparian zone. One is it has a very thick sod layer on it and a good soil seed bank for it, so it's hard to get rid of with it. And then as it grows tall, it will grow taller than most of the plants that you're planting, and at some point it will lodge over or fall over in the season, and it can take the plants with you for it. So you've got a couple of alternatives with reed canary grass. You can scalp around about a 3-foot diameter where you're going to plant the plant with it, or you can spray to kill it, and probably it's going to take multiple sprays, and that's the part of the 2-year site process. I'm working on a research project with Clean Water Services in Hillsborough now, and they do a huge amount of riparian restoration, and very concerned about the amount of glyphosate that they're using on their riparian projects for site preparation, because they're spraying about twice a year for 2 years with it. So we're working with them to try and look at alternative formulations that allow for using a lower concentration of glyphosate in addition to what are technically termed adjuvants or additions to it. In this case, it's just a fertilizer, ammonia sulfate, that gives up its electrons to the hard water if your mixed water is hard water. So there is some interesting things going on kind of alternative methods to control these weeds, but the bottom line is you do need to control them. Then if you're in an area with some of these other weeds in here that are typically more in old homestead areas. Japanese knotweed, it was a garden plant that kind of got out of control. Very pernicious, reproduces from just the smallest fragment of the plant. It can grow a foot a day. I've been there, seen that. And it's very hard to control. It takes a number of ways of spraying, years of spraying with it. And from my investigation, there is no viable non-spray treatment alternative for it. Policeman helmet and English ivy, these are again things that are typically started from old homesteads and then have just kind of spread out from there with it. Field bindweed, wild cucumber, those are things that were in more pasture agriculture areas, and those have a problem because they will climb up on the plants, and they can bring the plants over with them just due to their weight, or they just basically shade the plant out because they grow up with it. So those are, so understand what you've got out there for weeds ahead of time, and recognize that when you control one weed, you just may provide an opening for other weeds that will come up that have been suppressed by your primary your alpha weed has suppressed all these other weeds, and as soon as you take care of your alpha weed, all of these other ones will come up for it. So spend some time getting to kind of be very aware of the weeds and ways to control them. And again, there's some good resources for weed control. I mentioned a little bit about planting stock and some of the problems with bare root planting stock for it. So this stuff has to be handled gently. So potted stock, I mean, the common nursery potted stock, I mean, really all you have to do is water it, and largely kind of keep it keep it in the shade, keep it out of the sun for it. Bare root stock has essentially all of its fine roots exposed when you're buying it. And so that's very fragile. And if you dry those roots out, you have killed that tree with it. And so you might as well not even bother planting it because it's just a wasted effort for it. So the bare root stock, you really have to be careful about keeping them moist and cool until you get them all the way until you get them in the ground. So even when they're in a planting bag and you're out ready to plant them, you have to be careful that they don't dry out through the course of the time that you're doing the planting too with them. And kind of, the other planting stock types have kind of, less, but are also sensitive to these things. Probably the easiest one, particularly in the, if you're doing all of this stuff in the winter, is cut stock. I mean, you can keep them wet. You can actually even submerge them. They like that. And then you're basically either just sticking them right into the ground, or you're using some sort of planting bar to create the hole for it, and you're putting them in the ground. And the only consideration there is you want to make sure that you put them in the ground the same way that they grew up originally, because otherwise your trees are going to come out in China and they're not really going to do you very much good. So understanding the planting stock and the handling piece, if you don't handle the stock properly before you get it into the ground, that's really going to affect your subsequent success for that. So like I said, keep the seedlings moist and cool and shaded, and don't pack them too much because they do need some air to breathe for it. Okay, so the third place, so let's assume you've got this whole thing in the ground, good. Your job's not done with it. You need to keep on top of these plants at least until they're free to grow. And that may be 5 years if you're lucky, could be 7. It will be probably at least 5 years that you need to spend some quality time out on your riparian site maintaining it if you're going to be successful with it. And that's in many ways is just protecting the investment of time that you've made in getting these plants there. Because if you turn around and you think you're done, then you will find that when you turn your back on this stuff, you've got all of these weeds coming up. You may have all of these different types of varmints out there that are eating and chewing and chopping down your plants. And so, an investment in maintenance is going to carry you through to the point where they can have a higher likelihood of surviving on their own. And that typically is free to grow survive on their own, although I would make the case that there's still a lot of potential hazards to these plants, throughout basically their entire life for it. But the primary piece of maintenance really is going out there and chopping down competing vegetation around it. And so typically you need, for each planting, you need about a 3-foot diameter around that plant that's devoid of competing vegetation. We'll talk a little bit about how to do that. But you also need to be careful while you're doing that vegetation that you're not damaging the plants that you've already put so much effort into getting into the ground with that. So, and how often you have to do this maintenance is really dependent on the condition. So for example, if you've had really good site preparation out there, you got good control of the weeds before you planted, you may only need to go out there once a year to do maintenance. If it's a very challenging site and your site preparation wasn't that effective, you may need to be out there a couple of times a year for it to be successful. ways to do it. So, so a lot of this maintenance is preventing the competition from weeds, even the competition from grass, like pasture grass, that's also using the moisture and using the nutrients that you would prefer to have directed to the stuff that you planted. So the way to do that is, again, you can scalp around the tree. And in this case, a Hodad or a hazel hoe or something else is a fine tool for that, for it, because you're just basically pulling the soil back around from the plant and grabbing the roots and the weeds with it. You can put weed mats in when you're doing the planting for it, and mulch. And mulch needs to be kind of redone periodically as stuff takes root in it. But weed mats are basically that fiber, plastic fiber. So, there's some problems with that. Landscaping material, for instance, that's about a 3-foot square of it, and you slit it and you put the plant through it, or you slit it and put it over the plant and put it down on the ground. The key part with weed mats is you need to use what are called staples, which are basically just wire that's in a kind of U shape for it, to hold it down to the ground. Because one thing that happens with weed mats is that small mammals really like to go underneath it because they're protected from predators above, like owls and hawks and things like that. So they can hide under it, and those are the same critters that want to chew around the base of your tree, that can end up girdling your tree because they like the cambium layer in there, because that's where all the sugars are for it. So weed mats have positive, a lot of positives associated with it, but then you also have to be careful with them, that you're not encouraging other things that are going to damage your plant. You can mow and you can weed whack with things. So if you've got a bigger area, a lot of people use those field mowers in there, and you can get around with a field mower if it's not too steep for it. And you can get around with a weed whacker for it. Again, you've got to be careful to avoid the trees that you want to survive in there while you're cutting the stuff that you want to remove. One of the ways that we do that in our practices is to put a little bamboo stake in. They're pretty inexpensive. They're probably 5 feet long, and you just stick it in, and either you stick it in and it holds a Vexar tube that also protects the plant from browse, or you just put it in the same place for every tree, and that where there's a Vexar or where there's a bamboo stake, a foot away from it on the downstream side, is the tree that you've got. So that just tells you that the kind of area to be careful of as you're mowing around for it. And again, you can spray. You can spray for maintenance with it. You have to be more careful spraying with maintenance than you did before you had the plants in there, because you want to make sure that you don't kill the plant. And so that's choice of chemicals, choice of season that you're spraying, and also in some cases people are using kind of little cones that they put over the plant, almost like a traffic cone shape, that they put over the plant, and then they spray around it, and then the cone protects the plant from the spray drift for it. So but spraying works, and spraying is cheap, again, if that's consistent with your management approach for it. So we talked about competition from weeds, but there's also a lot of competition from animals out there. So you've just planted a food source out there. So I mentioned a little bit about the tree voles and other small mammals that like to girdle trees. And one of the things that we did with that, actually, it was developed by an extension guy down in Coos County, was to put aluminum foil around the base of the tree. And apparently these small mammals don't like to chew into aluminum foil. And I think about when I bit down on foil with my fillings, and you get that little electric charge for it. And so maybe that's what's happening with these voles, is that they bite into the aluminum and they get a little electric charge, and then they avoid it in the future. And that's pretty easy to do. And you're doing it from a large scale, just go to a restaurant supply store and buy those hamburger wrappers for it. They're already cut for you for it. Mentioned Vexar tubes. Vexar tubes are good to protect against browsing. You may want to use Vexar tubes in certain species like western red cedar that are highly palatable to deer and elk and things like that. And other species that aren't so susceptible to browsing by animals don't need the tubes for it. We've also used and developed this idea because we were losing a lot of cottonwoods, bigger cottonwoods to beaver, and discovered that our local newspaper was virtually giving away, at least until they discovered we had a use for it, giving away their used printing plates. And so a newspaper has an aluminum plate that is the size of a printed page for every page for every day that they do a paper, and they don't reuse those plates. And so we were getting these plates from our local paper for, I think, a dime a piece or a quarter a piece or so, and then just wrapping those around the trees and putting it on zip ties in to hold them. And then after a few years, the zip ties broke down under the sun, and it opened up that tube so the tree could grow with it. Chicken wire does the same thing. Again, you have to be careful with chicken wire not to wrap it too tight, or the tree will grow, and if the tree grows into the wire, it can girdle itself just through the wire part for it. So you need to pay attention to that, or not wrap it so tight with it. You can get up to bigger wire cages with fencing that's useful to keep both beaver out as well as elk with it. You'll be using T-post, and it'll just be like a small fence. Or if you want to go, upscale it, you can fence off entire areas in exclosures. And where we've done that, we've had, depending on the species, quite a bit more survival, higher survival, but also even more so on those trees that survived, we had quite a bit more growth. So the height growth difference was really phenomenal between the trees that were in exclosure versus the same species that were immediately outside the exclosure. So in one case, we had a western red cedar that was outside the exclosure that never got out of its Vexar tube, because every time it put a branch out of the Vexar tube, something came by and nipped it off with it. And so this was a 10-year old tree that was still in the Vexar tube, still living, but really not thriving with it in comparison to some 30, 40 foot high western red cedar that were in the exclosure. And so I mentioned we do have these resources out there for that. This first one, Guide to Riparian Tree and Shrub Planting in Willamette Valley, is the best one that I would recommend for just first approach to it. For it was written by forestry extension folks in the Willamette Valley, and they really know what they're doing with it. Specifically for Himalayan blackberry, there's another extension publication that Max Bennett did that's also quite good. If you want to get more into the planting techniques, and particularly the monitoring, if you're really interested in monitoring these sites where you're actually tagging trees and following them for it, the Coastal Oregon Riparian Silviculture Guide is really good with that, and that's one that I helped develop for that. And then Metro has a really nice guide that's not just for riparian areas, but it's native plants for Willamette Valley yards, and it has a much broader range of species coverage than these other guides do, and it's really quite nice for that. So I recommend all of those. We've got the web addresses for them. They're all downloadable and free. So that would be the first place I would suggest starting. And then I mentioned throughout that there is technical assistance available to help with this stuff. There are soil and water conservation districts and watershed councils. Most all of them have active riparian restoration programs. They have access to a range of funding available for assistance to landowners. Natural Resource Conservation Service basically runs the Conservation Reserve incentive program, either Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program for 10 or 15-year contracts for riparian restoration that provide annual payments, rental payments, basically for that piece of land, or through the Wetland Reserve Program can put in a perpetual easement on a piece of property, and the government then holds the easement, so you don't have to go find somebody for that. So your local NRCS office is one way to get that, but most of the conservation districts and watershed councils also have, broker those sorts of deals. And then finally, extension has coverage, and you've got good extension agents in the valley that are very knowledgeable about this, and certainly get in contact with me, and I can provide some help or some direction for it. So I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce the idea of riparian restoration with it. It's important to really think about these 4 take-home messages here that I have. Your project has to accommodate the site, because it's difficult to change the site to accommodate your project. So start with really understanding what the site is that you're working with. Be aware of your surroundings for it, and not just biophysical surroundings, but also social and legal considerations for it. Any investment that you make in site preparation will pay for itself long-term in the success of your project. So it's really worth putting the effort into that in the beginning. And then finally, I've talked a lot about free to grow, but free to grow isn't the ending point really for this, because your project really isn't done until you've met whatever the objective is that you are looking for, whether it's wildlife habitat or aesthetic values, or bank protection. So you can get trees free to grow at 5 to 7 years old, but you may still have a decade or so before you start seeing those benefits that you really wanted from them. So this is a long-term process to be successful, and the threats and the challenges to it vary over time with it, from the initial site preparation to the question that we had about conservation easements and how do you maintain this thing over time. One of the threats that we've seen in these projects that I've been monitoring down in the Coos Bay area has been landowner change, and that's been one of the biggest factors in changing the projects. Is you have landowners change, and they have different management objectives, and they may go in and clear areas, for instance, if it's not meeting what they want for it. So there's a lifetime of threats in putting this stuff together, but it's also really rewarding when you get to it and when it's successful. And it doesn't take a long time for it to start being rewarding. For the balance between the effort required to keep the stuff alive and the rewards that you get for it, changes, probably after that 5-year period or so. So these are 3 examples of projects that we worked on that I'm kind of continuing to monitor. 2 of these were conservation reserve enhancement projects. So the landowners had them in 10 and 15, had them in this case in 15-year contracts, and they got assistance to put them in and to do the maintenance, and they got cost share for it. In fact, in most cases with those programs, you don't have to put any of your money into it. In the end, it pencils out so that it's net zero for you, and then you get a rental payment for the land that's put in the conservation program that's based on its value typically as pasture for it. So those are all good. This one in the center of the South Fork Coos River, that was the first one I worked on, 2002. It's now 18 years old for it. The picture that was taken at the bottom there for it was taken about 3 years ago, and the trees were, that had Sitka spruce and had grand fir in them that were 40 feet tall, had some cottonwoods in it that were 105 feet tall for it. So it's pretty, pretty substantial response given the relatively short period of time that was in there for that. So I want to end that, and I'm looking forward to seeing some questions. We have a short poll that Julie's going to do.
Hi, John. Yeah, great information. Looks like some great projects there. And just because we want to make sure we get people here close to 4:30, we launched the final poll. So just wanted a chance of people before they might have to leave at 4:30, get a chance to respond to the poll. Also, John, if you can share, next week we have last 2 webinars that we have scheduled are Andy with Red Alder Management, and then Mike Bondi and friends are going to wrap up the July webinars anyway on Words of Wisdom from the Woods panel. And then, like I said, more webinars will be added, especially from True School East. So keep an eye out, and there's a lot of great things coming up. So just like John today, a lot of great information and experts sharing their information and a chance to interact with them and get some questions answered. So we do have some questions that came in. So John, the first one is, how might we go about organizing or joining a cross-boundary project?
Well, so here's the way that we did a lot of it is we invited the neighbors to have coffee, or we invited the neighbors over to something we called a coffee clatch. That actually engendered a whole lot of interesting cross-boundary cooperation, including bunco games and a Thursday evening prayer group. So the first thing, and so this is, in some ways that this cross-boundary piece is social capital. We've lost so much social capital because people are no longer living on the land full-time, making a living full-time, where they're dependent on their neighbors, and they had to cooperate with each other, or they were in an irrigation district or drainage district or something that really built on that cooperation. So the first thing to do is find out who your neighbors are. And in a lot of places now, the counties have the county assessor's information is online, so you can go on the web and you can find out who your adjacent landowners are. The other thing is, I'll come back and, again, based on my experience, is that watershed councils are a great place, and soil and water conservation districts are great places to build what we've called actually neighbor sheds. Because they're a logical group of neighbors. Either you live along a road or you have fences in common or something like that. So that's my recommendation. My first recommendation is just call up or we send postcards to people and invite them to come over for coffee to talk about things, and either in somebody's house or in a Grange Hall or fire hall or someplace like that.
Yeah. I think Neighbor Sheds might be the name of your next publication.
Okay.
All right. So is burning like propane torch mainly for annuals, or will they be effective on perennial immigrant plants?
I don't know. Okay. So I've not been involved in any burning like that to know that for sure. So I'm gonna punt that one.
Okay, and then this came in before, I think you talked about beavers, but someone asked about beaver protections, and I'll also mention OFRI did do a whole publication on beavers that are on the Know Your Forest website, so that's also be a place to go. But anything else you want to add, John, about beaver protection or anything else about the animal?
Well, so I was having an interesting conversation this morning with a colleague of mine who Vanessa, who is a beaver expert with that, and we were talking about this idea of, are people planting riparian zones with beaver food in mind for it? So we've got a lot of people out there with restoration, and a lot of the salmon restoration now follows what we colloquially know as the leave it to beaver strategy with it, and figuring that if you get beavers and you get beaver dams in there, you will get the conditions that are suitable, particularly for coho salmon in it. So we've got people building beaver dam analogs. We've got some people moving beaver around, which by the way is not successful. And so the question that we were talking about is, does anybody intentionally plant enough food for beaver? And if so, what would that look like? And she was talking about anywhere from, to support a beaver colony is going to take 6 to 18 acres of willows. And I'm going, I don't think anybody's planting 6 to 18 acres of willow for beaver. So the question is, but some people are saying, well, we're going to plant some willow for beaver out there. And other people are talking about how do we protect our plants from beaver. And so there's a couple strategies that I've tried with that. One is that you do plant a lot, particularly of willow, which you can do for the stakes pretty easily and inexpensively, and assume and pray that the beavers are going to like your willows versus your red cedars and cottonwoods and things like that. So that's the kind of distract them by providing them with food. And the other one are some of those other techniques that I talked about there about protecting individual trees from beavers, or actually our exclosure had that wire that had increasingly gradient on it, and so the bottom foot or so was fairly fine, and the beavers did not get through that wire in the exclosure. So you can do that over a bigger area, and ours were about, I think, 20 by 50 feet or 30 by 100 feet, things like that. Or you can protect individual trees with it. And the printing plates worked reasonably well with it, although the beaver kind of did figure out that they could move it up. But we had pretty well-read beaver out there.
So John, our last question, just maybe a minute or two, is there a need to do, or can you talk a little bit about like Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board and their reporting process if you are doing these restoration projects or things above and beyond like the Forest Practices Act? Is there usually a need to report that, kind of those volunteer actions, and how do you go about doing that?
So I think it's very important to report that stuff. That information is used in a number of different ways. So one part of it is just the voluntary nature of watershed restoration that Oregon really leads the country, if not the world, in that. Nobody likes doing reporting, or at least I didn't like doing reporting with it, but I saw, because I was starting to use the information that was submitted from that it is valuable to do it. So how do you go about doing that? One is that you can go to the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board website, and it's possible to either get access to the reporting documents there, and they typically once a year put out a call for people to report stuff, but you can actually report it any day of the year with it. So I think you can get access through that, or there's contacts with their staff people that are in charge of that reporting that I know would be happy to work with you on that. Again, alternately, working with the Watershed Council or the Soil and Water Conservation District, they're reporting that stuff as well. And a lot of the timber companies and woodland landowners are reporting as well, because they're doing quite a bit of voluntary riparian conservation by just not harvesting in riparian areas. And some of the companies are better than others about reporting that. So
great. Well, John, as we wrap up, in our final poll, we had about 75% of the people that responded thought they wanted your next class, the intermediate. And we had a response that said, I definitely will be interested on the intermediate right after I get started on my restoration project and plan, so I have some experience on the ground. Right now, I have a lot to think about from this one.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's very difficult. I mean, I can't see you guys. I see Julie and I see Mike Clossey's picture there. This is the first real workshop I've done virtually with it. And as I was telling Julie beforehand, I think the class I'm going to be teaching this fall is probably going to be virtual. So thank you for being my pilot class for this. And again, I think there's contact information for me available on the site, and I'd be happy to hear from any and all of you.
Great. So yeah, people can go back to the Know Your Forest and to the Tree School Online site and grab your resources, your PowerPoint. Eventually, we'll also have your recorded webinar up. So a lot of great resources there. And hopefully they'll join us also next week for 2 more webinars at 1 in the morning and 1 at 3 p.m. So thanks, John. Appreciate all your great information today, and have a good rest of your day.
Okay, thanks, folks. Take care now. Stay safe out there.